So I was sitting in a cafe this morning thinking about today's show and making some notes and reading some stuff. And I overheard a conversation as I do, as I like to do. This is one of the things that the animal behaviorist in me enjoys being able to do. And frankly, it requires anonymity. And so it's become a little bit less easy to do the more of this that we put out into the world. But in this case,
ethical eavesdropping.
Yeah. Often I will then engage with the people. In this case, I didn't have the opportunity. But it was two men, a young man and a man that could have been his father, although I think he wasn't, at breakfast. And I heard I heard them say, listen to what they're saying. They're saying this new variant is brand new, so get vaccinated with the vaccines that don't work very well in the previous new variant. And this guy continues, he says, it makes no sense at all, no sense. And yet most people seem to be buying it. And then, I didn't actually catch which of the two guys said that, but then the younger man says, in the context of this little piece of the conversation, he says, my friends all sound the way that I do on this, meaning, the messaging is making no sense. But then I look around, he says, and I know that almost everyone else doesn't see it. And I'm hearing this, and I think they weren't actually in earshot of anyone else in the restaurant. And they sort of were looking around the restaurant when they said that. But my sense is actually that those conversations, like the one I overheard, are happening far more frequently than the people who are having them believe. And that is intentional, that is sort of necessary, that we believe that we are a tiny minority and that we stay in our little pockets without any connection to one another, and that we believe that everyone else is going along with something, even if we can see that, pick your narrative metaphor. The emperor has no clothes, or when you look at the man behind the curtain, he's not what you thought. Any of these things which are true and Plato's cave. Yeah, exactly. And I think there is the potential for hope to be found in the recognition, I think, that there are actually many, many more people who are awake, at least at some level, than mainstream messaging would have us believe.
All right, a couple things. I'm seeing the same phenomenon. A lot of people are waking up. Mm-hmm. Sarah Silverman had a moment yesterday.
Really?
Yeah, which was one people did not expect.
Yeah.
I think a number of things are happening at once. One, the rate at which people are waking up is high, and that's very good. On the other hand, something else is accelerating, maybe because people are waking up so quickly. So part of the game here has been to leave a mind. So your mind was built by selection for a world in which you actually walk around and you sort of do an unscientific census of the world that gives, if somebody has a freak accident in front of you, that may not tell you anything. If it happens 3 times in a week, you may think, well, what's causing this? And maybe nothing is. It can be random, but sometimes it isn't. But anyway, the point is the mind is, under normal circumstances, very good at getting a sense for whether something is up. And whether something is up, socially speaking, when you actually have contact with, 1 billion people via some social media platform, right, that thing would trigger you to recognize that, hey, we're not all on board with the same narrative, except that the platforms are throwing people off who disagree. Those people who are still on who disagree are demonized. They are portrayed as if they've lost the plot, etc. All of these processes. And what it does is it games the mind so that the mind becomes very comfortable with things. And so this leaves you and I know, for example, from our larger than common social circle, we have a lot of people in contact with us now. Mm-hmm. Large fraction of those people have very serious private doubts, many of which have not been publicly acknowledged.
Many serious what?
Serious
private what?
Doubts.
Doubts. Okay. I thought you said debts.
Oh, I don't know anything about it. It's impolite to talk about it. I haven't asked. But
many people with whom we are in contact have doubts that they are keeping to themselves, but they will share with us, for instance.
Right. And many of them, frankly,
doubts about the public messaging, about the safe and effective messaging, and about all the rest.
Right. They have doubts about these things that have, in many cases, some cases have not governed their behavior, and in some cases have governed their behavior, and they're now wondering what to do in a world of mandates that they may not qualify to get the check mark from. And in any case, we get a very bad idea of how common these doubts are, and the arms race to keep us in the dark about how common our perspective is ratcheting up rather precipitously. We, of course, are stuck in a predicament with something like Australia, where, yes, it's true, we're not in Australia. We're not in a position to know directly. On the other hand, you and I know two people who have fled Australia because they believe that there is a very powerful force that will not be transient, that is engaging in authoritarianism of an egregious kind.
Furthermore, we do live in Portland. And we have lived in Portland for a little over 3 years at this point. So we were here during the summer of 2020 into the fall of 2020, and in some cases saw directly the protests that regularly turned into riots every night for something like more than 100 consecutive nights, and the damage to downtown, and the enduring damage, and the just wasteland that so much of, frankly, a lot of East Portland has become. And yet it's not everywhere. Even then, even at the worst time of it, it wasn't everywhere, and it wasn't all the time. It was actually fairly predictable when and where it was. And Portland is tiny compared to Australia. And so people could plausibly, granted, I don't think they were actually doing honest journalism, but people could plausibly come into Portland during the height of the reliably nightly riots and stand in the middle of a beautiful square in the middle of the day and say, I don't see any Antifa here, therefore it's not real. And that story was bought, right? So if that can happen in Portland, which is frankly very small, and anyone who was interested could have asked almost any resident of Portland, where would I go to see these alleged riots? And they would have been pointed to the right place, and they would have seen it. In Australia, it's far bigger. It's still looser. There are a couple of these places where people are now being funneled. But by and large, the argument that you're not here, you don't know what's going on it's a feint, FEINT. It's a feint, because there are a lot of people who live in Australia who won't be directly seeing what is happening in other parts of Australia.
Well, there's that. And there is also the problem that the incentives surrounding acknowledging what is taking place mean that if anybody who is in Australia can pull rank on anybody who isn't in Australia, right, then what you get is an effective veto over a, yes, imprecise, but nonetheless accurate perception. Something has gone wrong in Australia, which is now engaged in behavior that is not, we have internment camps. Okay. We have internment camps in which you cannot leave for a period of time, but then you go home. Okay. That's not it's not Manzanar.
Right.
But it is something. And, we have a right to think about it.
And it's another form of stay in your laneism, which, we have previously argued against all forms of stay in your laneism, because the lane that may be actually legitimately described by an historical discipline that really did constrain certain kinds of inquiry that involved certain kinds of methods that if you weren't familiar with, you might not know how to assess claims of truth in that discipline, right? That said, the standard way to acquire that knowledge, which would allow you to assess claims within that discipline, because they are corruptible, they have become corrupt, and therefore requiring that you have followed the standard way to acquire knowledge is a way to accelerate the corruption. And that is true even in places where there might actually have been a lane historically that was legitimate. But, geographical stay in your laneism, I live in this quadrant of the planet. It's not quite a quadrant, but I live on this continent, and therefore I know what's going on here and you don't. Well, that's patent bullshit.
Yeah, that's not.
Yeah.
It's a little
Yeah.
bit like Sarah Palin having lots of foreign policy experience by virtue of Russia being just over the strait.
And that was easy for half of the country, including us, at the time to laugh at. Like, oh, for God's sake, But now it's roughly the same half of the country just buying these kinds of absurd arguments.
Right. Well, in a sense, I mean, you and I have bristled at stay in your lane since the first time we heard it, because of course it is a territorial argument, and it is used to silence that which is inconvenient, etc. But the argument you just makes me realize that effectively lane, as it's being used in this case, are a kind of blinders. And the idea is you are to blind yourself to that which is outside of your lane. And so my sense is that we actually have, what was the thing we talked about a number of streams ago? We talked about the obligation to disagree.
Oh, yes. Which, gosh, I'm going to mispronounce his name again. Richard Rierson, I think, on his podcast revealed that he's both a former Marine and I believe a commercial pilot, who said that in aviation there is a obligation. I don't have the framing right. I can't remember exactly the phrase, but an obligation to disagree,
to challenge,
obligation to challenge, not a tolerance for challenge, but an obligation to challenge.
And so I think basically my feeling is not only should we reject this stay in your laneism, but we should found stay out of your laneism. Right? That you have an obligation to get out of your lane and see what is adjacent, because frankly,
or
you're living in a...
I wouldn't say stay out of your lane. I'd say get out of your lane. So, you also get to live in whatever domain you feel that you legitimately have expertise in. You don't want to throw out...
get out of your lane is better.
Yeah.
You're right. Stay out of your lane is linguistically more fun, but get out of your lane is right. But anyway, I mean, at some level, look, this is... I don't know. I'm having the sense that something is going on this week, and it may be that it's just crossed a threshold for me this week, and that it's not really this week. On the other hand, it may be that there's something to it. And increasingly, it's like, look, either, yes, our enemies will make hay of this, but either we've just lost the plot and we don't understand the first thing. And I think, you and me. And I can effectively prove that short of something amazing like, schizophrenia, in which none of what we think is evidence is actually even external to our minds. But short of that...
Including all of the people we are interacting with.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But short of something really exotic like that, you can effectively prove this isn't true. It doesn't mean that we know what is going on, but it means that you can detect the anomalies. They're everywhere. And the thing about your frickin' lane is your lane allows them to construct a Potemkin reality in front of you. And our basic point to those with whom we disagree is we see the Potemkin reality also. But if you stand over there, you'll see that it's a set. Right? Yeah. You're being led to understand a particular picture. You have dots put in front of you, and you are thinking that you're clever for connecting them. And the point is, it doesn't add up unless you do stay in your lane.
Yeah, and I think, actually, there's like little breadcrumbs dribbled for people, I suspect, in which people are allowed to feel clever for discovering little anomalies or, things that don't quite fit. And then they think they've gone all the way.
Right.
And, this one this whole, again, the metaphors are endless, but, for the moment, let's just call it a house of cards. You can't take one card off and go like, now. You can't take one card off the top and say, now that thing is built on a stable foundation. That's not how foundation works.
Right. And in fact, here's one. I had a little fun this week. I put up a poll on Twitter. Obviously polls on Twitter aren't scientific because, people who follow me and therefore see it are not a random sample, although I asked people to distribute it to places that wouldn't be reached.
It's a put up your finger and see which way the wind is blowing in this very, in an admittedly local sphere.
It's a straw poll.
Yeah.
And the point is a close answer wouldn't tell you anything, but an answer that's wildly off in one direction does. And anyway, I asked people to rate what they thought the level of pharma corruption of academia, government, and media was with respect to COVID relative to average. your average disease, and it was like, it's negligible, it's below average, it's about average, it's above average. And the answer was 84% of people thought it was above average. Now, here's my point. Above average doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean it's tolerable or intolerable or anything. But our public narrative is as if there is no corruption here.
Right.
Whereas people privately apparently...
Talking about the corruption that at least has been demonstrated to exist in all previous attempts to deal with public health with pharmaceuticals is immediately called a conspiracy theory, as opposed to actually the burden of proof that this isn't happening is on you. The default hypothesis here, the null hypothesis, is that this is business as usual and that the pharmaceutical companies are not actually engaged in trying to heal people so that they no longer need the products.
Right.
Like, that's the null hypothesis, not the other way around.
Right. In fact, certain things like, we know that pharma routinely knocks drugs that work out of the standard of care in favor of drugs that are under patent, right? So when a drug goes out of patent, there's a question about, the pattern of discovery of something new that's claimed to be even better is unnatural, right? If that's normal, then why do we assume it plays no role in the claims by pharma, in this case, that X, Y, and Z doesn't work? And so anyway, just even a baseline assumption that, hey, there's a whole slew of evidence. People become expert in pharma corruption. It's, in fact, a very fascinating and complex phenomenon. You can read RFK Jr.'s book, for example. You can read Ben Goldacre, right? Pharma corruption is a powerful, powerful force, and it does involve adjusting people's view of things. And until you've at least figured out what baseline is, and at least allowed that baseline might continue into COVID, you're not even in a position to have this discussion.